Director of Global Washington based in Seattle. I'm one of the co-hosts here today. You'll see Julia Kennedy is here as well from the Posner Center on International Development based in Denver. And I know a lot of you are joining because of the Posner Center as well. Just briefly, Global Washington is a network of 165 organizations that have a presence in Washington state and do work to improve lives in low and middle income countries. We have nonprofits, companies, academic institutions, and foundations that are part of our network. We're really excited to continue this topic today with the Posner Center because we've been collaborating on an effort called the Goal Makers. And we think that those of you that work as practitioners in global development are actually the goal makers that will help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN. So we call our work the Goal Makers Initiative to honor what you do every day to advance the goals and the targets to create more equity in the world. So our format today is going to be a panel discussion. And we're going to do the Q&A through the tab on the bottom. You'll see that's where you should type in your questions and type in your questions there, and I will look through those and verbally ask those questions of the panelists, and then they'll verbally give answers back. So please hold off on typing in any questions for this period of time as the panel speaks, and then closer to 11 o'clock, we'll open it up and you can type in your questions there. We are recording today's event, so keep that in mind as well. So before we get started, I actually wanted to do a land acknowledgement. I know that we are all virtual and in different places, but I still wanted to acknowledge, especially for those of us that are in the Seattle and Denver area. For those of you in the Seattle area, we want to acknowledge that these are the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people that represent 66 tribes and First Nations. And for those of you in the Denver area, we acknowledge the land of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and 48 other Indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado their home. We want to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to the original and current stewards of this land. For those of you that are not in Washington State or Colorado, I encourage you to visit a website that we'll post in the chat to learn about the First Nations people or the first people where you live today. So before we get started, I wanted just to give a little bit of context around the topic. We're talking about climate justice to acknowledge that Indigenous people around the world are disproportionately impacted by climate change. However, the good news is that if we actually center Indigenous communities in the solutions, then we would have Indigenous knowledge and a holistic approach that would make a better long-term solutions to the fight against this climate crisis. So that's part of what we want to do today is really acknowledge and center Indigenous communities. And I am so honored to have a distinguished panel of speakers here today, again, with organizations that are doing this looking at climate change in a very unique way. So I'll do a brief introduction of the speakers and then we'll dive in. First, we have My-Lan Dodd, who's an attorney and is a senior land tenure specialist at Landesa. Landesa is one of the global leaders in land rights and is based in Seattle. My-Lan has worked there for over 10 years, and her expertise includes collective land rights for Indigenous people and women's land rights. Her previous experience includes working at the Native American Rights Fund in Anchorage and the Northwest Justice Project in Yakima and the ACLU of Washington. Next, we have Jason Fileta, who's the Vice President of Communications and Marketing for Tearfund. That's headquartered actually in Europe, but has a US office as well. Jason is a longtime advocate for climate action and engaging churches and people of faith to become advocates for climate action. Jason has led delegations to multiple G8, G20, and UN summits to promote climate justice. And prior to Tearfund, Jason was the executive director of the Mika Challenge, which was a global movement of churches and organizations combating justice and injustice and poverty. Our next speaker is James Ratlane Leaf Sr. He's actually joining us from Rapid City, South Dakota. And James has many different titles, but one of them is a research associate at the Cooperative Institute Research at the University of Colorado. He's also a founding member of the Group on Earth Observations, or GEO, which is a global alliance of Indigenous peoples to foster respectful and reciprocal relationships with Indigenous communities around the world. James has over 25 years working with the US federal government, higher ed, and NGOs to create effective relationships with American Indian tribes and tribal communities. Our final speaker is Sherry Manning, who's the founder and executive director of Global Seed Savers, which works in the Philippines. And Sherry actually served in the Peace Corps in the Philippines about 15 years ago, where she worked with communities to create an organic farming training center and youth environmental education facility and promote ecotourism. From this work, she founded Global Seed Savers in 2010 to continue on. Thank you all for joining us. Again, I'm going to start with a series of questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A later on. The first question I want to pose to all the panelists is this idea of climate justice. It's a fairly new term, but the concept is not new. So I wanted each of you to actually talk about what the words climate justice mean to you. So My-Lan, I want to start with you. Can you help define what and set the context for what we think of for climate justice?
Yes, thank you, Kristen, and thank you for having us all here today. Given that Landesa is a land rights organization and not a climate change organization, I think we can contribute to the definition of climate justice by advocating that it should include securing land rights for rural land users and particular Indigenous peoples and local communities. Land rights should be part of the mainstream conversation on climate justice for two reasons. First, there's huge inequality in who are the top greenhouse gas emitters and also who bear the brunt of climate change. In addition, there's also huge inequality in terms of who enjoys secure rights to land. According to the UN, Indigenous peoples contribute least to greenhouse gas emissions, but are some of the first to face climate change's direct impacts. And climate change exacerbates challenges already experienced by Indigenous people like marginalization, human rights violations, and loss of land. And only a fraction of Indigenous and customary lands are legally owned by these groups. And across this situation, women are also placed in a situation where they're exacerbated by existing gender inequalities. And our planet is a shared resource, and the land we share is finite. The UN recognizes that how we use land can contribute to greenhouse gas emissions or its storage or removal, and how we've exploited our planet's land and resources so far through processes of capitalist development, industrialization, and colonization has culminated in our current climate crisis. Land rights, that is the rules that define people's relationships to their land, and land governance are tools for resetting this needle. So a big picture of climate justice that includes a land rights perspective should include reforming land rights rules to ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities can legally access, enjoy, and control their land around the globe to redress historical injustices. Governments should recognize their collective land rights and should respect and enforce them with this to the same degree that they do private property. This can help resolve conflicting land claims and land conflicts in favor of Indigenous peoples vis-a-vis the state and commercial actors who use land in ways that heavily contribute to emissions. And this gets legal rights to land to those who have longstanding physical and cultural ties to the land and a land ethic and land use practices that conserve land for future generations. A climate justice definition that includes land rights should also include gender justice as a cross-cutting focus. This means that ensuring that secure rights to land for Indigenous peoples and local communities are equally guaranteed to Indigenous women and men as recognized in the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Second, we can't solve the climate crisis without land and natural resource management abilities, knowledge, and sustainable ethos of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Securing their rights can be an effective means for mitigating and adapting to climate change. Indigenous peoples are environmental stewards, and they can be more effective with stronger rights to land. A recent IPCC report on land and also other mounting evidence are part of the growing consensus that land rights for Indigenous peoples and local communities are central to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and also to biodiversity preservation and sustainable development. And the climate crisis is dire. The Paris Agreement aims to hold the increase in the average global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the IPCC doesn't consider this level safe for most communities, ecosystems, and nations. There's no room to not fully exploit effective climate mitigation efforts, and there's no room to not fully recognize Indigenous peoples' right to land. And for governments who have signed global conventions on climate change and biodiversity, securing rights to land for Indigenous peoples can be a strategy to advance their environmental commitments. And there's onus and opportunity for the global community and governments to engage Indigenous peoples as equal partners and to invest in them as change makers and land rights holders in the fight against climate change. Including land rights as part of the climate solution holds positive outcomes for communities and the environment alike.
Thank you so much for that. I love the idea of really thinking about this from the human rights perspective, the land rights perspective, the even legal perspective. I think in my view, that's kind of the cornerstone for a lot of this. So that was a great definition. Thank you. Jason, I want to turn to you. Can you tell me what the words or the concept of climate justice means to you?
Absolutely. And thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this. And thank you to everyone who's attending. I think My-Lan put it really well. The injustice of climate change is essentially that the people who've done the least to cause it are suffering the most from climate impacts. In our work at Tearfund, primarily as a poverty alleviation organization, there's no way to address poverty without addressing climate change. You run up against it constantly. So just some examples of what those impacts are that people are experiencing. I remember working on the Millennium Development Goals before the SDGs, and every year seeing improvement, specifically on reduction of people experiencing food insecurity and hunger. And in 2014, and that's been the trend actually since the 90s. And in 2014, we saw the proportion of people experiencing hunger in our world increase and rise, in part because of conflict and violence, wars breaking out, but also in part because of climate chaos, people having to flee their ancestral lands, people having to migrate because they can't grow food anymore, and what we would generally refer to as just climate disasters or climate chaos. There are over 1 billion people, and this is a UN stat here, 1.3 billion people living on deteriorated agricultural land. So this is land that is, because it has become hotter and drier, is much more difficult to produce food. It is much more difficult to live on. The people who are experiencing that are not the same people who caused these impacts. These are not your high emitters. These are not, corporations in the US, China, and other nations that have contributed so heavily to greenhouse gas emissions over the years. So that's, to me, like the injustice of climate change, is that it's not simply like some reality we have to live with. It's not just some place we found ourselves. It was caused, and it was caused, and there is suffering because of it, real suffering. And the injustice is that the people who are suffering the most really had nearly next to nothing to do with the cause. And so that inequality and that of outcome there is really an injustice. And so I like the phrase climate justice because I think it sets the frame of how we even approach the conversation. And I recall a certain world leader who often referred to the Paris Climate Agreement as a bad deal. And I think that was because part of the Paris Climate Agreement required some of the high emitters to actually fund climate adaptation for some of the most hard impacted communities around the world. And that seemed like a bad deal to some leaders. But personally, if it's a bad deal, it's a bad deal not because of that effort. It was a bad deal because it didn't go far enough in making right the wrong that has happened. I don't think it's a bad deal, though. I think it's a good agreement. I'm really glad our nation is back on board. And so I'll leave it there. But I, again, really appreciate this opportunity and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. It was really good to think about, you know, the opposite of it, the injustice comes from climate change rather than just the term climate justice. That's a great way to frame this. Sherry, I'm going to turn to you next.
Great, thank you so much. And again, a big thank you to Global Washington and the Posner Center for organizing this and having us. Thank you for doing the land acknowledgement as well, and something that we always like to do at Global Seed Savers, and me in particular, as I sit here in Denver, but I'm representing our communities across the Philippines, is acknowledge that we also work with many of the 110 ethno-linguistic and non-Indigenous peoples of the Philippines. And for us, seed saving is really part and parcel with their traditions and their practices. And as I've been thinking about climate justice, for us, you can't separate food and seed sovereignty from the climate and from the injustices that Jason and My-Lan both mentioned. So at Global Seed Savers, we really believe that thinking about the land, so I'm really glad Landesa is on the call, and thinking about our food systems. And like Jason pointed out, the fairly recent level of injustices in those systems that have caused a lot of our climate crises. The answer to all of that is to return to this indigenous wisdom of saving seeds and promoting food sovereignty. So again, really excited to be here and represent the communities that we work with. Another thing, just to give you context for our work and in the Philippines, I don't know how many of you know, the Philippines was recently named the most climate vulnerable nation in the world. It's 7,000 islands. On average, around 20 typhoons hammer the islands every year. And over the last 10 years, those have only increased in frequency and intensity. Thankfully, last year in 2020, there were actually only 8 typhoons that hit the country, which was kind of the world maybe giving the Philippines a bit of a pause during all these other challenges that are happening with the global pandemic and everything else. And then just another context to set for you, I think for us at Global Seed Savers, climate justice also means the ability for these communities, mainly Indigenous communities, to feel safe and comfortable to speak up about how this is all impacting their lives. And unfortunately, due to other political dynamics, it's becoming increasingly dangerous for our partners on the ground in the Philippines to engage in these dialogues. Communities have to really think through how they want to show up, how they want to have a global presence and a local presence about these issues, because their lives are literally being threatened by speaking out about what's happening. And so, you know, I think, again, just to reiterate what Jason said, the justice component of this is essential. And I think for us, so much of that means that we step away as some of the Western voices here and really take the lead from our leaders on the ground. And we've grappled with that as an organization as well. You know, the safety of our farmers is the most important thing. And in a country like the Philippines right now, people are really having to question whether or not they're speaking up and out against these injustices. And so I really just want to center the conversation in that as well. But for us at Global Seed Savers, food and seed sovereignty is an essential piece of this work. And actually, I can get into this a little bit more if there's time, but seeds are literally designed to adapt to changes. Seeds have DNA and resiliency built into them. And as an organization, we really believe that it's returning to that tradition of allowing seeds to do what they've always done, which is tell us stories, teach us the history of our past and our future, and allow them to adapt to the land and the climate changes that are happening. And so for us, that's the work that we're engaged in and a part of, is helping return the ability for farmers to practice what's been in their lineage for a long time. And frankly, what's been in all of our lineage. If you look back, all of our ancestors probably had a role to play in saving seeds and promoting food and seed sovereignty. And the answer to a lot of these challenges is returning to that ancient wisdom. So again, we're really happy to be here and thank you for having us.
It's great. Thank you, Sherry. And it really an important context to think about how we do climate advocacy in the sense that there is a trend of a closing of civic dialogue throughout the world as well, even before the pandemic, and then even the pandemic is exacerbating that. So thank you for that context, for sure. James, I want to turn to you now. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the terms climate justice means to you?
Thank you, Kristen. Haumidaki api chante washten nape chusapalo. James Rowlingley machi api nashi changa lakoto yate. I greet you today with a good heart and handshake. My name is James Rowlingley, and I'm a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. Let me begin my comments with a story. People started arriving in the summer of 2016 carrying water. They came from all over the United States of America and then from all over the world. American Indians, Maoris, Mongolians, Muslims, Sami, Hindus, environmentalists, clergy, veterans, and water Wookiee warriors. Thousands of them came to protest, pray, and offer solidarity with the Lakota people of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, which was under threat. A 1,772-mile pipeline was proposed to move 470,000 barrels of crude oil a day from North Dakota to Illinois. This Dakota Access Pipeline would pass under the Minnesota or Missouri River, a half a mile north of the Standing Rock Reservation, crossing sacred lands and burial sites and threatening to contaminate the reservation's water reservoir if it ever ruptured or leaked. The world took notice, drawing a global attention to Lakota's struggle for water rights and sovereignty. The Lakota people today continue to endure. We will always find our place in the world because we know how to be fully in it, adapting to its shape while remaking it again and again after our own image. In our prophecies, it is told that we are now at a crossroads, either unite spiritually as a global nation or be faced with chaos, disasters, disease, and tears from our relatives' eyes. Each of us is put here in this time and place to personally decide the future of our humankind. Now, I had an opportunity to speak at a UN environmental discussion here this past year, talking about this and also how we might address that. And I guess, you know, from my perspective, that was the Standing Rock, what we know as the Standing Rock or the Standing Rock struggle. And in that work, you saw direct action. You saw working with Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous spirituality, and our partners, all in this effort to decolonize ourselves and decolonize way of thinking. And I think as we talk about climate justice today, I think about, you know, those things that were said at that gathering, where our elders, our knowledge holders were sort of leading the way with in prayer and in solidarity, but also with partners to think about this whole issue of climate and climate threats. And so I think there's some things that we can learn from with these kind of direct actions. Indigenous people led efforts like that, but also in partnership with allies and really thinking about how we bring the best information forward to addressing these issues of climate impacts and what we must do as humankind. I really think that Indigenous people, you know, need and have to have a place at the table. We may even have to rebuild the table, what that looks like in terms of how people come around the table to help make decisions about the future of climate, the climate crises and things like that. So I'm really excited to be here to share our thoughts, my thoughts going forward, and how our organization, the Geo-Indigenous Alliance, is really committed as a global organization to address what I call tribal or Indigenous cultural heritage in a changing climate, and how we might look at our own ways of knowing to address that, but also the role of a Western approach to science, data, and technology. So with that, I'll stop there. And again, thank you for the question.
Thank you, James. That was very powerful in terms of really getting us grounded again in the realities of what this really means. So thank you. Thank you for that. My-Lan, I'm going to turn back to you again. And you mentioned this a bit in the opening, but I'd love for you to dive in a little bit more and elaborate on how land rights is central to climate justice for Indigenous people.
Thank you. I'd be happy to. So first, I'll provide some framing. There's 370 million Indigenous peoples whose land covers some 20% of the Earth's surface, and they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous people and other local communities hold at least half of the Earth's land, according to experts. And they're part of the 2.5 billion who rely on land and natural resources. But only 10% of their land is legally owned by them, according to WRI. Indigenous and community land are particularly at risk of exploitation by states and commercial interests whose use will contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And land rights are central to both climate mitigation, adaptation, and human rights. In terms of mitigation, global evidence recognizes that forest preservation is crucial to climate change mitigation. Rainforests and mangrove forests are huge carbon sinks. WRI has shared some remarkable facts. Around a quarter of the carbon stored in tropical forests is found on Indigenous and local communities collectively managed land. And the amount of carbon stored on Indigenous and community lands is 4 times the amount of the global carbon emissions in 2014. And in the Amazon, Indigenous people with secure land rights reduced deforestation by 50%. Indigenous land rights can preserve critical carbon sinks, and Indigenous people defend their lands from destructive exploitation, mega projects, land grabs, deforestation, and they risk their lives. Since the Paris Agreement, an average of 4 land and environmental defenders have been killed each week, and a disproportionate number belong to Indigenous peoples, according to Global Witness. A former UN environment head said, "No one should fear for their life because they call for the Earth's resources to be used carefully and in a way that respects their communities." Securing land rights is an upstream intervention for protecting Indigenous lives and human rights by resolving conflicting land claims, taking the fuse out of conflicts, and positioning Indigenous people to thrive while stewarding land and natural resources to mitigate climate change. And in terms of adaptation, it's important to emphasize that climate change stresses Indigenous peoples in their environments, and it's critical to secure their land rights to protect land access and use to support their ability to adapt and ensure that they and their culture survive. Indigenous peoples from Alaska to West Papua speak about their land environments as their grocery stores, dependent upon for their subsistence and cultural survival. Stronger rights will allow them to more securely rely on the land to provide for their families and communities, particularly needed when climate change stresses those ecosystems, and to do so without having to simultaneously fight for their land. When Indigenous peoples and local communities have secure rights that are gender equal and socially inclusive, they're better able to make investments that conserve soil, water, build resilience to climate change. And land rights can also help in recovery from natural disasters and slow onset hazards. Landesa has worked with thousands of families to protect and reforest degraded mangroves. And mangroves not only sequester 4 times as much carbon as rainforests, but they also protect coastal farmland from soil erosion, provide livelihoods, and provide wildlife habitat. And in one village, Landesa's efforts supported 400 households in receiving secure rights to community forests. And as a result, formerly struggling families have now more than doubled their monthly income. And Landesa works with governments and partners to support the delivery of land rights, including to Indigenous people and local communities. Within land rights reform processes, governments can devise and implement progressive rules to benefit Indigenous peoples and local communities to recognize their land and human rights to promote climate action. In Liberia, the government recently passed the Land Rights Act, and it broadly recognizes legal rights for customary communities and their women and men members. And these lands are no longer state-owned. Communities now have the legal right to their land and can better defend it from unwanted large-scale investments that might otherwise damage the environment and the climate. And land governance beyond land rights is also critical to responding to the climate crisis. Climate impacts like sea level rise, land and soil degradation, and increased floods and droughts can disrupt or even discontinue land access and use for housing, livelihoods, and cultural activities. Climate-related disasters are on the rise. And governments can use land use planning as a means to reduce the effects of disasters and also to avoid new hazards. And governments must be able to manage climate-induced migration, which is on the rise, and also manage retreat where sea level rise displaces coastal communities. And these types of actions by government can help deliver climate justice for Indigenous peoples and local communities.
Thank you, My-Lan. That was very good. It's so important to talk about these issues now, and then the moment of time that we have to do some mitigation as well. Jason, I want to turn to you. As My-Lan said, natural disasters and climate are exacerbated by climate change. Can you, and I know Tearfund works in emergency relief, can you talk about to what extent natural disasters impact Indigenous communities and how maybe Tearfund is working with Indigenous peoples during natural disasters?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've all seen, and many of us have even experienced, assuming the audience is largely from Washington or Colorado, just how much our day-to-day lives are impacted by climate. In our cases, we've probably both experienced a lot of more fierce and closer to the city wildfires. Well, that kind of climate disaster is happening on a larger scale around the world, especially with increased flooding because of typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones. And these are happening in coastal regions and areas that are highly impacting Indigenous communities. One of the most powerful things about attending a UN climate summit is not the world leaders. You might hear my coworkers, sorry. Hey, can you guys close that door? I'm just gonna continue. The impressive thing about attending one of those meetings is the, not the world leaders, it's the Indigenous communities that show up and testify to how climate change is impacting their communities, how the increase in disaster. Okay, close that door, please. Thank you. And one thing I just wanted to mention in disaster response, thank you all for smiling and not grimacing. I appreciate it. They're wonderful. One of the things I think is worth mentioning and something that we've been learning over the years is, you know, there are sustainable ways to respond. There are more sustainable ways to respond to disaster that don't actually perpetuate the problem of climate change more. So one of the things that we do and work really hard to do is to invest in the local communities and Indigenous communities to generate whatever is needed in the response. So if it's food, buy that food there. If it is water, secure that water there if it's possible. Another thing that Tearfund has worked really hard at just to have a more sustainable disaster response when climate chaos strikes is after people have resettled to their homes or gone back to their lands, is to help people with setting up some good conservation, climate resistant agricultural techniques to be able to provide for themselves in the long haul. I think the old school days of disaster response that bring in a ton of outside resources that don't generate anything in the local community or the Indigenous community has now been clearly seen as not the ideal way. And especially when we're talking about climate change, even just the physical cost on the environment of shipping food all over the world and this kind of thing, when it could be found right there, is something for all of us to consider. And so I think that there is a lot that we can learn from Indigenous communities on how to be more sustainable, even in responding to disaster. There's a lot of knowledge there on how, in resilience. And so some of our adaptation and how we respond to crises has come from that, just local leaders partnering with us and teaching us the way, teaching us a better way. And I will stop there. Thank you all for being patient.
Jason, that's great. No, thank you for that. And you know, we all know this new reality with being at home with our family as we're working. So no worries there. Thank you for those words. And I think that probably set up Sherry for a perfect conversation in terms of thinking about local food. And, you know, definitely even in the pandemic, it's kind of flipped the food security concept on its head of really thinking about buying local. But Sherry, I want to turn to you. I know you're passionate about this. So can you talk a little bit more about your organization and what that means to Indigenous communities in the Philippines as it relates to climate justice?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. And I really just wanted to appreciate James's comment of building a different table or building a new table. I actually, you know, something personally that's, I think, has continued to kind of frustrate me as the pandemic has gone on is all the conversations of returning to something, because I think that if any of the pandemics that we're facing right now, be it COVID or climate or political or racial justice, we have to build a different process, right? We can't actually return. That's the old norm that isn't working. And so I appreciate you saying building a new table. And for us at Global Seed Savers, that has to be rooted in our communities, which many of them are Indigenous communities. And I think what we've seen just in terms of seed sovereignty and food sovereignty is, and kind of a cue up after Jason, is often that's the afterthought because of a disaster, right? That's kind of how the world has trended. We think about food insecurity only when the food insecurity has been threatened, when I think the lessons we learned from our Indigenous partners is that's fundamental to how they're living out their life. Thinking about food sovereignty, thinking about what they're growing, how they're growing it, allowing it to adapt to the ever-changing climate is fundamental to how we all used to practice agriculture around the globe. And so for us at Global Seed Savers, we really want to be a part of the conversation as we move through these continued disasters of how do we ensure that seed sovereignty is a part of that conversation from the beginning, and it's not just an afterthought. And so I'll just share an example of how we've been kind of working on that with our partners on the ground. You know, for years, we've been encouraging and working side by side with our partners saying, you know, farmers have tremendous wealth, right? And I think in the context of a country like the Philippines, it's easy for farmers to feel like they don't have wealth, right? They're often based in a rural environment. They're selling all their products to hyper urban environments. And I think it's easy for farmers to feel like maybe they don't have wealth. Well, the pandemic has highlighted that actually farmers have the greatest wealth. And in particular, farmers that have seeds have the most wealth. Because what we've seen throughout the pandemic is this hyper need for urban communities in a country like the Philippines, in particular, capital region like Metro Manila, which I think is the 5th most densely populated city in the world. I don't have the exact number, but it's jam-packed to the brim with humans. The food insecurity that the pandemic demonstrated is now allowing urban folks to say, how are we going to grow our food? How are we going to sustain ourselves? And I think what that's done for our partners is help them realize they may be 7 hours away from that metro area, but they have tremendous wealth to provide to their communities because they grow food and they save seeds. And so as we move through all of these continued challenges, I think it's rerouting in those traditional practices that's going to get us through. And so something that I always like to say is I think in this sector and in this work, it's easy to kind of always want to be innovating and like thinking about the next big idea. And I think we're in a place as a world where actually going back to old traditions is what's going to carry us forward. That doesn't mean we don't think about new technologies and new ways to interact and learn from each other. But I think at a very fundamental level, how we're going to address these challenges is returning to simple systems, right? I don't remember the exact person that said it, but our mentor in the seed saving world often says this: you can't run delicate systems from command central, right? And so a system like food sovereignty and feeding people has to be community-based. It has to be grounded and rooted in community and ensuring you're taking care of that first, and then you can take care of the bigger community. So, you know, we at Global Seed Savers really try to always center those voices. And one other example where our model has really been tested due to climate realities was 3 years ago when one of the 20 typhoons a year hit our main founding community. All of our partner farmers lost everything. And our farmers are frankly used to that, right? They know that storms are going to hit them year after year. But our seed library, our founding seed library remained intact. And so literally days after the storm, all of the farmers were able to go and access seeds that they had grown, that they knew were adapted. And to Jason's point, they didn't wait for aid to come in from these big multinational, international organizations. They had what they needed on the ground in the community. And for us, that's the model that every community needs. A seed library in every community, not just in the Philippines, but frankly, all around the world, is going to ensure our continued food and seed sovereignty. So again, just really wanting to honor and center that those answers, I think we already have. It's just, again, building that new table and making sure that the answers that have always been there can come back to the forefront of how we do this work.
That's great. Thank you, Sherry. And it is something I know that the Posner Center in Global Washington is really focused on during this time of COVID, that we have to build back in a different way. We're not going back to the way the systems that we had. The whole concept of decolonizing global development and the way we do our work is central to how we need to move forward. So that was a great perspective. James, I want to turn to you now. We've been talking about land rights and natural disasters and food security, and I wanted you to add to this and add your perspective, because I know you have a global alliance of Indigenous people. What do you think are some of the most pressing issues for Indigenous communities as it relates to climate change?
Well, that's a great question. I always have to say, well, I guess I'm one voice in all this from a global perspective. This is really my first time working at that scale at a global level. But I think it's really an honor and a privilege to be part of this. And what I'm going to do is I put a link into the chat for the panel as well as for the participants. And so we just hosted a what we call the Geo-Indigenous Summit. And so that link is in there, where we brought together over 1,000 people around the world to come together to talk about how they're using Earth observation data when it comes to dealing with the changing climate, women's empowerment, youth, intergenerational knowledge transfer, COVID-19. Some of these big, what I call big issues, big problems, big challenges. And in those conversations, it's real interesting to see that, when Indigenous people come together, and in some ways we're grateful for these platforms now that we can speak to one another, whereas it'd be very hard to go and travel. But these are allowing us to start these relationships with one another, to really talk about what's happening in their own communities. So I really think that, number one, obviously it's always great to have authentic Indigenous voices speaking. I think two is that people talk about creating the space. I've been working with some colleagues in Canada, First Nations people, and we talk about this term called ethical space, or two-eyed seeing. Ethical space, so it recognizes that there's sort of two ways of knowing. You have a written Western approach to understanding the world, and you have an oral tradition or Indigenous perspective of understanding the world. And rather trying to integrate them or bring them together or try to force fit or even weave them in some ways. I know we could talk about language and semantics here, but I like this idea about a third space called ethical space, where there's places where you can kind of begin to look in at each other and understand each other better. And then with that, allow yourselves in to see where you can come together and do things together, maintaining the integrity of both systems. So I think we need those sort of things. We need some that kind of approach to these kind of issues where we understand we're different. We also understand what happened to us. And I think as we grow and understand that, I think we're trying to chart a path forward. So the summit was really trying to bring those kind of thinkings together, but also really trying to understand that there are some things in place now that we can build upon. I'm always mindful of things like UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights of People. How do we roll that out? How is that being practiced in a way when it comes to building these partnerships between Indigenous people and funding agencies or conservation areas or climate change science? So I think there's progress being made in terms of how we do that work and how we do that in a better way. Also, I think that certainly from those Indigenous partners to the Alliance, we think about those in the South America and Amazon. One of our founding members is one of the leaders in COICA, which is a regional organization in South America representing Indigenous people and Indigenous interests. So when I hear him talk through a translator, because I don't speak Spanish, but through a translator, I'm mindful again about sort of where they're at in their own reality. Yeah, he still has to pay for his internet access to talk to me, and still they don't have that opportunity, infrastructure really to do these kind of things yet. You wonder if this is the way we want to go. What's that going to look like? But obviously, COICA and all those groups, need to be part of that conversation. And finally, I think about sort of these mechanisms in place now that establishes our relationship as Indigenous people, and particularly in America. So I didn't have talked about treaties yet, but when people talk about us and think about us today, they wonder, how do these reservations, for instance, in America, come to be? And I have to remind them that there is a unique relationship between the federal government, United States, and Indigenous people here in America. So those are treaties. Those are these legal binding agreements between sovereigns. And so I see that the Harris-Biden administration is advocating for this new policy now working with us. And I hope that happens, because when that happens, I think we can see progress in terms of how we can be self-determined. We are self-determined, but to continue on that self-determination pathway so that the decisions that we make on behalf of our lands, our people, our cultures, in our future is important. My final point will be is on January 27, 2021, I became a grandfather for the first time, and I have a granddaughter. And what happened to me in that time was that, it reminded me as an Indigenous person about my role and responsibility to that next generation. We talk about the seventh generation a lot in our work, but the things that we do today is going to impact the future. So we have to have that mindset, I think, going forward, that this is, the time that we have, the resources we use, so forth, it really is a stewardship kind of approach. So I think that's why, and I talk about all that generation, my granddaughter and all granddaughters. So I think about women's empowerment more and more than I ever have, because I look at my granddaughter now and I hold her and I think about what are the barriers that she faces today that I can be a part of, that we can be a part of minimizing or taking away, so that she has a future that's great for her and other Indigenous women, but also all women. So those are things that I think we have to be motivated by, is that this future thinking, but also to Sherry's point about these Indigenous technologies, these Indigenous knowledges are still relevant today. And so we have to figure out ways to raise that up again, and we do that together. Thank you.
So great. Well, and congratulations, James, on your granddaughter.
I got some pictures if you want to see.
I know. We'll share your screen and post it. No, it's so great. And thank you for reminding us that it's not enough just to center Indigenous voices in this process, that it is a process of listening as well for those of us that are more attuned to Western concepts, and creating a third space, that ethical space for really communicating and creating progress. So important. A fantastic way to think about it. Thank you for that. So I have one more question for each of you, the same question for each of you, and then we'll go to the audience for some Q&A. And if you've been to a Global Washington event before, you know that we are, just as James said, we want to also think about the future. And it's been so unusual to think about it during COVID, again, as we were just talking about kind of rebuilding and don't let this crisis go to waste. Take advantage of this opportunity to create something better. So my question for all of you, and that's maybe a positive spin, but my question is, are you optimistic about the future? And again, it's okay if you're not. We just want to, again, hear from your perspective. Where do you think we're headed as it relates to climate justice and your work? My-Lan, I'll start with you again.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think for me, it's both just what I know about the history of Indigenous people, the centuries-long struggle. When I listened to Indigenous people speak about the present day challenges, I was at a continuing legal education where a leader from West Papua was speaking, where their lands are very much under threat. They're very much worried about their people's survival. And they had a question where it was a full Indigenous panel, and they were speaking to this as well. And they were pessimistic just given the realities and the challenges that continue to persist. So I think it's important to acknowledge those barriers that are just massive. There are also reasons, I think, for optimism. The pieces that James talked about, just the tremendous organizing by Indigenous peoples in face of these, Standing Rock, his Geo Alliance, all the organizing to get UNDRIP adopted by the majority of countries around the world. Those are huge. That creates a different landscape to work from. The rights that it recognizes that people see and agree to, they're very robust. They're very robust collective rights for self-determination, for land, territories, and natural resources and culture. And that recognition globally was not there before. And I think it has new platforms for people to speak from and to partner across. The other reason for optimism is that community land rights in legislation and national legislation is becoming mainstream. I read this post by a global expert, and she was saying that 40 years ago, there's just a small handful of laws that recognizes community rights to land. And today there's, I think, some 70 out of 100 countries recognize some form of community rights to land. So I think that's very promising. There's also growing attention, I think, to women's land rights within these reforms to make sure that women and men, Indigenous peoples, are equally enjoying these rights to land that they rely on and need for their survival. The other reason, the silver lining of the climate crisis, I think it gives a very strong imperative for like why it should have already been done and why do we need to do it now if it's not done. And if those who do have land rights, if they're not being enforced, why it's really critical to enforce them. The other reason is I think there's some movement. We have a team at Landesa that does corporate engagement, and there are company leaders that I think are starting to change norms around how you do business, and it's not business as usual, and it's getting an understanding of how these investments that are made from very far away, the impact that has on that ground, and setting up principles for more responsible investment. Also, there are more multilaterals and development finance institutions that now have policies that safeguard Indigenous peoples and their rights. So taken together, I think there's opportunity to leverage these different, the Indigenous people's rights, sustainable development goals, climate change action that is needed. Some of the solutions are all the same. So you advance and you can advance across these different arenas. So I think that's promising. And I think in terms of priority, it's just a real need to invest in this and to invest in rural areas. Thank you.
It's great. Thanks. It's good to hear the optimism. It's really important for all of us, I think, doing this work. So that is really good. Jason, I'm going to turn to you and ask you the same question. Are you optimistic? And again, some people are more optimistic with the Biden-Harris administration coming in. If you think about, President Biden has called for a summit on April 22nd for climate, and just from your past experience in working kind of on these global summits and G8, G20, are you optimistic in that sense? And are you optimistic in the work you're doing with Tearfund?
Yeah, it's a tough question because part of what motivates me is fundamentally this belief that things can change. So I have to remain optimistic at some level. But on another level, climate impacts are devastating and real, and we run up against them constantly. And I was trying to think, like, what does keep me optimistic? And some things are very practical. So for example, there is going to, I think, be more opportunity for international cooperation and legislation in our own country. But at the same time, just as easily, we saw how if a president alone is taking action, it's actually very fragile. And just like President Obama joined the Paris Agreement and President Trump pulled us back out, well, if we don't find a way for the commitments in the Paris Agreement to actually work its way into proper legislation drafted and approved by Congress, then I don't think we will see a long-term change on the policy side. And I see all that not as a policy expert. I'm not. I've definitely done my fair share of protesting, praying over, and delivering petition signatures at these events. I know a lot less about the actual policy, but my sense is we need real shift in Congress to see legislation, especially on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's going to last longer than a presidency. So on that front, where I do find optimism is just the youth movements and the Indigenous movements for climate justice. I thought about Greta Thunberg and how this young woman started protesting by herself on the Friday strikes, and totally, completely alone. I saw a photo the first time she did it, and she was completely alone. And then less than 18 months later, there was literally millions upon millions upon millions of people doing it with her. That really inspired me. I was like, oh my goodness, there is still goodness and possibility for change and mobilization. Another source of optimism for me. And I know I'm not really answering the question about whether I am. I'm talking about where I get optimism, which is a less practical thing and technical thing, is just when I go into the wilderness. So I was in Olympic National Park not too long ago in the Hoh Rainforest. When I go to a place like that and I encounter the wildness of the world and trees that are over 1,000 years old and things like that, it to me is this amazing reminder of how resilient the world is. Like, no matter all the things that have happened, all the degradation, all of the abuse over time, somehow, some way, places like that still exist. And that just gives me so much hope for the future, just that resiliency. So it's a mixed bag for me. Sorry, that was a long answer. Yeah.
No, that's great. I think a lot of people can relate to that. Again, it's kind of the high level UN policy space, and then being in the natural environment and seeing the resiliency around us, and the next generation. That's a great answer. That's good. Sherry, I'm going to turn to you. What are you feeling about for the future, maybe from the perspective of the Philippines or from where you sit in Denver? How are you feeling?
Yeah, no, it is a loaded question. And, I think just as a professional and as a person, something I'm working on and grappling with is, the need to always feel like we need to have answers to things. And maybe remembering that, Jason, I really resonate with what you shared about being in nature and reconnecting, really rerouting in these ethical spaces, like James mentioned. And I think for me and for us at Global Seed Savers, seeds are an essential piece of that. Going back to one of the most fundamental things that we all share, which is hopefully the ability to eat, right? And I know not everyone has that on a consistent basis, but there's so much past wisdom and knowledge that does give me hope and that does keep me optimistic. And frankly, in our work, what drives that is the partners and the team and the staff that we get to work with on a daily basis. We just had last night we had our first, we're forming a joint board of directors to govern our organization. That's mainly Philippine led. And that call was very optimistic because, again, I really think that communities have the answers that they need. And sometimes it just takes us building that new table and returning to that knowledge and trusting that we can do this. Now, that being said, there's a lot to be really concerned about, right? And as I mentioned, while our political climate is perhaps looking up in this part of the world, which I think is making a great difference, there's still a lot of work to be done around the globe. And the challenges that our Philippine partner communities face to be able to really authentically and truly speak to what they need is continuing to become risky. And so I think that that's where building these new tables can really be helpful. How can we as the global north shine a little bit more light on those realities to help ensure that those voices are going to be able to speak for themselves? And so I think I also sit in kind of that mixed bag. And I'll just close with, I don't have children, but I'm a very proud aunt. And I think I resonate a lot with you, James, that, and I've worked in youth development in past careers, this work has to have a bigger purpose. And I think looking to our future helps with that. It's not all on them. And I think that conversation can happen really easily too. Oh, it's all on you. It's all on your shoulders. It's like, no, we need to build this process of bringing in my elders, our elders, finding our own space as we move into this work as potential elders, and then bringing my nephew and James's granddaughter and all the other wonderful next generation to the table as well, because I think these siloed approaches are actually what have gotten us into the trouble that we're in. And I think by bringing more of those diverse voices together, we can continue to have optimism and head to where we need to head as a world. So my nephew and seeds themselves bring me optimism is what I'll end with.
That's great. I love that. Great. James, I want you to answer the question, and then right after that, we'll go to the audience for some Q&A. So again, if you have a question, type it into the little tab at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Don't put it in the chat, but pull it over to the Q&A tab, and then I'll verbally ask those questions to the panelist. And if you can, when you're asking your questions, if you could direct it to one of the panelists in particular. So James, you have the floor now. Let us know if
Okay.
you're feeling optimistic about the future.
Well, that's a good question, and I'll answer it this way. I think, you know, maybe from my individual perspective, I would say that it's not so much optimistic, but it's really based on a responsibility. I think from an Indigenous perspective, and as you know, working with Indigenous different cultures around the world, you know, we have a responsibility to this earth. If you understand our cultures and our spirituality, you know that that's what we do day in and day out. Every day we do our thing, you know, to continue to, you know, we, as Jason mentioned, pray, and we have our ways of doing things to help restore the balance of the earth. So Indigenous people have those traditions, and they still practice them today. And I would also think about the other R would be resilience. You know, what can our resilience teach us that brought us here today? I think that one part of that is this idea of decolonizing wealth. We have Indigenous thought leaders now writing books on this idea of decolonizing wealth, and I would even move that a little bit along and say decolonizing philanthropy or decolonizing conservation organizations. We have funders here with us today on a call, and I think you heard needs from Indigenous people. I would just say again that to be an advocate for a better way of financially supporting this work that needs to be done in our Indigenous community, especially when it comes to planning, funding for technology, funding for data, funding for training. I think there are good models out there already with Indigenous people that are doing this work now. I just think we need a better way of philanthropy to work with those folks and do it in a better way. Also, I would say that the Dakota Access Pipeline was really started by a young Indian girl on Standing Rock. So Standing Rock has continued to build. They're proposing new efforts, new organization around youth and climate equity. So that's happening. That's happening right now. And so they're organizing, right? They're not waiting for permission. They're not waiting for Biden or Harris to tell them to do this. They're doing it. And I think there's something about that that gives me energy, gives me encouragement to keep on going. And then, so the question of us is, how do we support them? What do we need to do to share our knowledge, our wisdom, our experience with them? And how do we, you know, connect with them in a way that that's helpful? You know, because, you know, what we're talking about is leadership. What's that next generation leadership look like? And what do they need to know going forward? And is that the technology? Is that skill? Is that leadership? Is that decolonization? All those things, I think, have to come into play really to address that and to really think about that. Finally, I'd say that, you know, that as we think about the future, you know, I'm reminded again about, you know, the work that we do at the Geo-Indigenous Alliance, and reminding ourselves again that it's this idea of partnerships again, and coming together as humankind. You know, we sort of need to figure out a better way to work with each other. We need to figure out a way to really respect our ways of knowing. I talk about 4 R's a lot in my work. I talk about respect, I talk about responsibility, and then relevance. You know, the things that we do, you know, should be relevant to Indigenous communities and what they do. And finally, I'd say is reciprocity. The longer you work with Indigenous people, you know that when we take, we give back. Yeah, that's just a fundamental value of Indigenous cultures, is reciprocity. So we need to think about those in terms of how we share information, we share knowledge, and also we share opportunities. I think when we start to transition, when we start to transform into that sort of way of thinking, and that mindfulness, I think we can make progress. And I'm hopeful that there are people that think that way today, that I've been a part of in my work with Geo-Indigenous Alliance, NC CASC, science, non-science, communities, elders. And so I think we have an opportunity here at a crossroads. As I mentioned, our elder talked about this crossroads. I think we need to pay attention and listen to those elders, and listen to them well, so that, you know, we can we can heed their warnings. And when they admonish us, we need to pay attention to that and change our course when necessary. So allow us to do that. I think we can build this future for my granddaughter and other granddaughters. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was really important to think about through, and especially going back to what I'm hearing over and over of having this space for communicating effectively and listening to each other for a better future. Incredibly important, and that we have youth leaders now that are not waiting. They're not the next generation that's going to come and be the leaders. They're actually leading now, which is so powerful. So thank you for that. We have a question from the audience. This one is for Jason, or if others want to chime in. But the question is about US leadership that we've been talking about. And this person, Mark Smith, wants to know if you're optimistic about the new USAID policy on promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples, or PROIP. Jason, can you address that?
So I actually can't speak to that policy directly because I'm not familiar. So I'd invite anyone else who might know more about that to chime in.
I'd be happy to say a word on it real quickly. I'm aware of it through Landesa. We were supporting USAID in developing some briefs on Indigenous peoples in different regions of the world to support missions who are working with Indigenous peoples and doing projects and including them. So I think it's promising in the sense that USAID has a big footprint all around the world and is working in just tons of different geographies, and to have that institution become more and more aware of Indigenous people's issues and what their responsibilities are when they're doing programming, I think that's a positive step forward.
That's great. And it is a brand new initiative program of AID. So again, I think there's a lot of hope right now, it seems like, for this new administration. And I think we should continue to monitor it as always, and make sure that these things come to fruition. Does anyone else want to talk about possibly USAID or the work that you all might interact? Sherry, I don't know if you work with AID in the Philippines at all. Okay.
Just one comment that's really important for these larger governmental institutions. So whether it's in the UK, DFID, or in Europe, or USAID or whatnot, a real investment in climate smart operations and aid. And so that might be like the UK recently made a commitment to around funding fossil fuel projects in the global South, and reducing that funding and possibly eliminating. I'm not familiar enough, so I'm not going to say the specifics of the policy, but there's a lot of potential for change when these larger institutions make commitments to invest in renewables or to stop funding the use of fossil fuels around the world and things like that. And so I think that's an advocacy opportunity that we probably have right now in the US that maybe wasn't there before, to encourage more activity like that.
That's great, thank you. We have another question from the audience. James, this is directed to you. It's clear, I think, for the audience that it seems like for change to happen at the necessary scale to avoid a climate disaster, Indigenous values of responsibility and reciprocity need to be adopted more widely, even beyond Indigenous cultures. So a question for you, James, is how do these teachings, how they should be best disseminated, and successful examples that you may have of this?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. I think we talk about the what, we don't talk about the how too much. And obviously the how is always the challenge. I really think it starts with these, with these it's got to be done together. I think to talk about UNDRIP is a framework of how you deal with Indigenous knowledges. And I think there has to be better understanding among the people that want to work with Indigenous people with their knowledges, their values and such, so that that we're practicing good UNDRIP principles or values. I think that's number one. I think we all got to get better at understanding how UNDRIP is rolled out and how it's practiced. And I think we could think about it in terms of what's happening in Canada. I would encourage a person to go look at Canada in terms, they're a little bit different than us in states, for instance, because they have something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They call it the TRC. And, you know, that was many years of bringing, they call them the settlers and the Indigenous people together to have these very, very difficult conversations about what happened to Indigenous people at a certain point in time. And these are residential schools, and these are assimilation policy, very, very, and we're still feeling the impact today. But out of that TRC, it's almost, and that came also from South Africa during the Mandela years as well. Is how do you bring a nation together again when they had these deep wounds, and then healing needs to occur. And so I think, you know, there was a motivation to, okay, we have these 85, 95 recommendations coming out of the TRC. And I think that part of one of those, or many of those, was the role of UNDRIP and how that is a framework to do this kind of work with Indigenous people. And I really think that has to be part of all of our education if we're going to go forward. I think Indigenous people, at least from my perspective, will think that, you know, these are adopted and supported by Indigenous people around the world. So this isn't just a one thing. It's universally supported in a way. But I think the challenge for us today is how do we, I'm not gonna say meld it, but I think really these engagement principles are very important, you know, going forward. And again, it's got to be based on equity, what we're talking about today. It's got to be, you know, decolonized in a way, but also it's got to have some semblance of a future that Indigenous people will want to hang on to and want to go forward on. I think when we talk about, you know, our languages, we talk about land rights, and we talk about energy development, and all how those things get forward, come together, and how they get developed in terms of policy, in terms of legal mechanisms. That's the work that we got to do. But I think that there's some fundamental things that we all have to understand. I think we all have to be better at understanding UNDRIP, the history of it, the current status of it, and then what do we need to do to practice those things here with our work.
That's great. Thank you. And it's a question related to that, actually, for My-Lan. Again, obviously, we're not going to be able to have these type of conversations and really co-creating solutions without healthy civil dialogue. And as Sherry mentioned, in the Philippines, there has been a closing of civic space just again over the past 5 years or so. Can you talk about that related to your work? And again, it can be a little broader than climate justice, but are you seeing a clamping down in certain regions in the world in terms of civic dialogue and allowing for advocates to voice their opinions?
I can speak a little to that. I think it has happened and is happening, and it's a challenging space. I think not just for land rights, but more broadly for just political dialogue and really basic political rights. When that space closes, it impacts how communities can stand up and talk. It impacts how NGOs and civil society can support those groups. So I think that's a big challenge. I can speak just a little for Landesa, our approach. We're headquartered in Seattle. We have offices in different countries throughout the world, and our path for trying to engage with governments in different countries, it really requires a willing government partner. So in places where it's closed down, like there's no opportunity for us to have those dialogues because there's just the space is generally kind of closed off. And so we kind of strategically look for opportunities where there's administrations that are interested in land reform. And I'm thinking about what James said, the importance of UNDRIP. Landesa is really focused on the how. So we understand that land rights are so critical to people living in rural areas, men, women, communities, and finding governments in kind of political openings that are willing to tackle that issue and see that as a priority, and working with them on the how to get people to the table to draft legislation that really recognizes and honors those rights. And in this case, that does that well for Indigenous groups and local communities. But I think if there's no space, I think it's hard for everyone to even have a dialogue.
Right, that's so important, and it is important, especially for an NGO headquartered in the U.S., to understand those dynamics and be invited in to a productive space for that to happen as well. And Sherry, do you want to add anything to that? Again, you've mentioned it a few times in your work, but anything to add?
I guess maybe just a couple of things to add. I mean, I think so much of what we're talking about is based on returning to like right relationships. And I think that that's where I just really echo everything that James was sharing. And I think that while the high level government challenges that we're seeing across the globe are very real, I think that, again, the answers come at that very community-based level. And so just an example for us at Global Seed Savers, you know, our founding community that we work with in the Philippines, we have a really wonderful relationship with the local government unit there. And again, that's because of right relationship, right? That's because of time. That's because of centering those voices and that leadership. And you know, we often say if every community in the Philippines had a municipal agriculture officer like our founding community, we wouldn't need to be having these conversations. And so our hope, as we continue to work within the context of a very challenging overall political climate in a country like the Philippines, is that we can continue to identify these very wonderful local leaders at government levels to partner with, because again, communities know how to do this work. And if we can identify that at a grassroots level, it can start to be a sea change that hopefully will come at a larger level. And maybe just a comment, since I'm sharing a lot about the Philippines, yesterday was actually the 35th anniversary of EDSA, which was the people power movement that took down Marcos as the dictator. And so I think all of us in this work yesterday were really thinking about what that means in the Philippines, and are we still having those same conversations about how you speak up and out and in these critical dialogues. And so I think, again, to kind of echo James's point, what can we learn from the past, and how can we carry that forward as we continue this work? So, but again, I think for us, that's centering it in relationship, and we're very open to that being government relationships, if and when governments are willing to do that work in that way.
That's great, thank you. And it's a good example of even the concept of climate action, because we need scaled solutions at the multilateral global governance, but we also need these community realities. And often when you talk to people, they don't think about it in terms of climate change. They think about it as droughts or coastal erosion or fishing and scarcity and food insecurity. You know, those are the realities that people are facing. It's not just UN negotiations. So really important to keep in mind. We have another question in here. My-Lan, this is for you. The person's asking if Landesa has been part of the negotiations of a global pact on the environment, or called the, is it ESCAZU, ESCAZU agreement? And this person, Christy, is saying that she's hopeful in these efforts that will protect Indigenous rights and environmental defenders while acting on climate. And it looks like the progress on the global pact has slowed, but the ESCAZU agreement will enter into force in April and may have influence beyond Latin America and Caribbean. My-Lan, are you familiar with this?
I'm not. We're not part of that. Landesa, as a land rights organization, we are figuring out how to engage more in kind of climate change spaces. So we've been involved in kind of the UN climate change conferences, and then also the Convention on Desertification. I think those are two of the main ones that we've been engaged on, and we're continuing to try to flex our muscle to figure out how to understand these processes and to figure out how our perspective and our ability to kind of work with governments on land rights, how that contributes to the solution. So thanks for raising it. I'll look into that agreement, because I wasn't aware of it myself. My colleagues at Landesa, so maybe other ones are aware, but I'm not.
Great. Anyone else have experience either with the Global Pact or the ESCAZU agreement? Well, Christy, you're going to have to report back to us and see what you found. I think that's it. Again, I do think there's some hopeful progress, and I think this year, 2021, is going to be pivotal, if I can use that word, in terms of how we either move forward or don't in this really important moment. We're getting close to the end, but we have time for one or two others. Julia, I've also wanted to ask you if you have any questions to pose, not to put you on the spot, but I know you've been listening, and I'm wondering if you have any other questions. I'll go to one question from the audience, and then Julia, I can come back to you if you want to think about a question as well. James, this is a question for you from Judy Ginn. She wants to know, can you talk a bit about what you think decolonizing global philanthropy would look like, in your comment you made earlier?
I shouldn't have said that. I should have said that.
You should. It's a great topic. Just talk about it a little more. It'd be great.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I think it's a conversation that's needed if it's not already started. The reason why I raise it today is just because as the Geodigious Alliance, we're seeking funding to start build out some of our 5 strategic pathways we want to work on. And so obviously we have to understand the current reality of how philanthropy works with Indigenous people in their communities, but also the process, the policies, and I guess I mentioned, are they UNDRIP ready? Are they UNDRIP? I mean, is this going to be that? Is that what the kind of organization that we want to be? And how we work with Indigenous people to gather funds or get funds, and then, what's the decision-making aspect of that look like? Who gets to make the decisions on the funding and how the funding's spent? What are the desired outcomes for that project, and also sort of the evaluation? So where does accountability come into this work? I know that there really isn't a global police person that's going to check these philanthropies of how they do or how they work in Indigenous people. I don't know if there's one that exists. And so if I wanted to work with Jason in understanding, how they work, do they have just like how you evaluate these apps today, you can look at it someplace and say, that's a good app, or that's a good organization, a good business. Do philanthropies have that? And when it comes to working with Indigenous, do they have these markers or these check marks to say that they're good or they're not good, and why? But I think that, maybe there are already groups already doing this kind of work, but I think that, for us at the Geodigious Alliance, we really want to be deep listeners with this work, but also deep thinkers of how we interact with philanthropy. My last point would be is I'll pick on conservation a little bit. There's a track record with conservation, how to work with Indigenous people, right? At one point in their history, and you guys could push back on me on this, okay? But at one point in their history, they excluded or they removed Indigenous people from lands. They wanted to be quote unquote wild, and so they took the people out. And so, okay, now we're doing this for somebody else's purposes. And I think they're slowly transitioning into, wait a minute now, we know that human impact on these environments is important. And so, like, for instance, fire, Indigenous fire was used as a management tool at one time. Indigenous people did that. So I think, this conversation about philanthropy and how they need to do better. And I also say that we need more Indigenous leadership within those organizations, who are the grant makers, who are making decisions, who are asking these more difficult questions about how that money is being spent. And again, are we still setting up a colonial system where I have the money, you need the money, and this imbalance? Or do we want a better model or a better balance of how that resource is being used together? So those are questions I have more than answers, but we're asking the questions. And I think that, that if that organization's out there, or there's things are happening where we can better understand working with philanthropy and to represent Indigenous interests in those conversations, then I think we need to do that.
That's great. That's a really good answer. And I know it's very good. It is important. I think
I'm not a lawyer like My-Lan. So I think
no, No, I think again, it is the idea of this power imbalance of funders and others, and especially in Indigenous communities. So, you know, and I think there are conversations definitely going on in the philanthropic communities on how to even be a better partner and again, co-creating projects, which again is something really important. And to add the concept of really thinking about Indigenous populations as you're doing your funding, if a funder's not already doing that, is critical. So important point to raise. Does anyone else want to jump into that conversation?
I would add just one thing there, which is sometimes centering Indigenous leadership and voices and ideas is in direct contrast with funders' desires for project outcomes that are predetermined. And that's like a reality that our broader sector of international development has to reckon with at some point. And, you know, one of the things that we've been moving more and more towards at our organization is just a model of partnership with local Indigenous churches and church leaders as a faith-based organization, where we actually don't embark on projects, we embark on a process. In some places, we even call it a friendship process. And then sometimes there is no exchanging of money at all. But incredible transformation happens in short periods of time, simply because of convening people and going through some facilitation of things together, and then seeing all the amazing resources a community already has to achieve incredible goals, to save together, to make massive transformations locally. And no money was exchanged from global north to global south. And that kind of work is like really affordable. It's very rewarding and meaningful and mutual, but it's not that attractive to certain funders who are very interested in seeing like huge delivery numbers up front of like X number of dollars equals X number of mouths fed. And so I think that's part of this conversation, is like sometimes the places we need to go feel like they're in contrast with the rules we have to operate within. So that's like a half-formed thought, but that's what I was thinking about when I was listening to James talk.
No, that's really good. And Sherry just posted in the chat a link to Decolonizing Wealth, which is a great resource. So we're running out of time. So I want to express my gratitude to the panel for sure, and for this conversation, for the audience that has joined us. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Julia from Posner Center to wrap up. Julia?
Thanks, everybody. I just wanted to thank everybody who attended, some great questions, and special thanks to the speakers. I thought one thing that was really interesting about this discussion is how we kind of looked at climate justice from different vantage points and kind of wove together a collage of ideas. And we had some thoughts on what's happened and why it's happened, you know, what injustices and climate chaos. But then we also talked about what needs to happen. You know, I wrote down a whole laundry list of that. And then also kind of the how and the who. And so I thought that having all three of those dimensions come together. So thanks very much to all the speakers for all the interesting points of view. And I hope that those on the call will join us again, Global Washington and Posner Center. We want to have dialogues like this, as Kristen said, with you all, the goal makers who are helping to get to where we want to get to and have a more equitable world and not go back to the way it was. So we look forward to engaging with you on different goals and different discussions throughout the year. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all again. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.